Okay, I think we'll get started, everyone. Welcome to the South Orange Library's Special Conversations program. I'm Laura Sims. And I'm really excited to be starting our fall season with our guest tonight, Anastasia Tsioulcas. Is that good pronunciation?
Yes, right on.
Okay, good. Who is an NPR correspondent for the Culture Desk. And I have a bio that I'm going to read more of for you. So she reports on the arts, primarily music, at the intersection of culture, politics, economics, and identity. Recently, she's covered gender issues and Me Too in the music industry, including the trial and conviction of former R&B superstar R. Kelly, the sexual misconduct allegations against megastar Plácido Domingo, and gender inequity at the Grammy Awards. Prior to working for the Culture Desk, Anastasia was a reporter and a producer for NPR Music, creating episodes for their much-lauded Tiny Desk concert series. She hosted live concerts from venues like the Metropolitan Museum of Art and Le Poisson Rouge, and she also commissioned and produced several world music premieres, as well as high-profile video shorts of performers like Yo-Yo Ma. Anastasia has also reported from North and West Africa, South Asia, and across Europe for NPR and other outlets. Prior to joining NPR in 2011, she was widely published as a writer and critic on both classical and world music, and was the North America editor for Gramophone magazine and the classical music columnist for Billboard. Born in Boston and based in New York, she is a, I think, self-described lapsed classical violinist and violist.
I will own up to it.
And she graduated from Barnard College, Columbia University with a BA in comparative religion. And we're lucky enough to have Anastasia here with us tonight, and she's going to share one of her recent stories with us and kind of walk us through the process, how she does what she does. So I'll turn it over to Anastasia.
Well, it's so nice. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me, and it's so nice to see all of you here. So I actually did a little bit of a left turn, and I wanted to share a recent piece that isn't music focused. Over the last several years, my work has really spread out in several different directions, but still sort of culture, identity, and often the arts, usually the arts are at the center of it. But this is actually a food waste piece about history, history of the South, history of the Gullah Geechee people, and the amazing Ms. Emily Meggett, whom I was very honored to spend some time with in her home kitchen. And I will leave it there, but you'll see that I snuck some music into this piece too. Couldn't help myself.
So we have an audio clip here.
Emily Meggett got a book deal at the age of 89. It's a book about her cooking. NPR culture correspondent Anastasia Tsioulcas traveled to South Carolina's Low Country to get a taste.
Edisto Island is a beautiful, quiet community of about 2,000 people, nearly an hour's drive south of Charleston. The roads are framed by massive oak trees draped with Spanish moss. There's a tang of sea salt in the air. Ms. Emily Meggett is known far and wide as the matriarch of Edisto.
Go right to that drawer right there, get a spoon.
I'm with her in her cozy home kitchen, where she's going to teach me how to make a local classic, shrimp and grits with gravy. As she chops up some salt pork to get us started, I ask her what's the first thing she remembers making as a girl.
Grits. Grits and the salt pork right here.
Ms. Emily is Gullah Geechee. Her community's ancestors were enslaved people from West and Central Africa. In their insulated locations throughout the coastal areas of the Carolinas, Georgia, and Florida, they managed to preserve much of their rich culture, language, and music. Her cookbook is called Gullah Geechee Home Cooking. Right now, Ms. Emily is focused on making her gravy. Salt pork, onion, flour, and some seasoning salt. That's it.
Now you watch me every step of the way.
She's stirring the pot constantly with her favorite spoon. This virtuoso in the kitchen doesn't bother with a whisk. Still, her gravy is as smooth as silk.
I'm from the old school. And people would, you add things to see how that's gonna taste. But sometimes I think they jazz it up too much. This is a tradition, how I learned how to cook it. Wash the grits, wash your meat, fry your meat, put your onion in there, put your flour in there, make your gravy, and your seasoning. Nothing else. That's your tradition.
Some of Ms. Emily's other recipes are intensely local too, like her delicious Benny wafers, sweet little cookies made with local sesame seeds. Benny seeds were brought over from West Africa by enslaved people and became an important staple in their hidden gardens. Ms. Emily's family kept their own gardens at home. They grew their own vegetables, beans, and fruit. They raised hogs, chickens, and other livestock. They fished and hunted.
So we even had our own rice farm when I was growing up.
Ms. Emily's ancestors, like other enslaved people brought to the Carolinas, were expert rice cultivators. And rice remains foundational in Ms. Emily's cooking. She says if anyone's going to try only 2 recipes in her book, it's 2 Gullah Geechee staples.
The red rice and the hoppin' john.
Her beloved late husband Jesse grew up nearby too, in a 2-room cabin that previous generations had lived in as enslaved people. In 2017, that cabin was relocated to Washington, D.C., where it's now on permanent display at the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture. Ms. Emily, whom friends around the island call MP, recounts plenty of family stories as well as her own complex history in Gullah Geechee home cooking.
When I came along, I guess I was the last of the slaves, because when I went out to babysit, I got $1.25 from 8 o'clock in the morning till 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And that was in the 50s.
Not long after, her mother told her she had to choose. She could either work in the fields or she could become a cook for wealthy white families. One of those was the Dodge family from Maine, and Ms. Emily cooked for them for 45 years.
And then when I went over to the Dodge house, a week's pay was $11.13 a week. And every year it went up $1.03. I start from the bottom of the barrel. Up to this time, I think I did good for myself and also my children, because if I wasn't taught what to do and how to do it, then I couldn't have taught my children.
And those recipes are imprinted in her memory.
That's how I cook. I cook by my brain and my hand and my heart.
Heart is a big word with Ms. Emily. She has always looked after Edisto. When the side door into her kitchen is open, folks know they can stop in for a plate of hot food. Cooking for Ms. Emily is about sharing history, and as she says in her book, food is one of the most important ways we can take care of each other. That was the whole impetus for her cookbook.
A lot of time we has a treasure in our head, and we will die and go to heaven and take that treasure with us. And why can't we just share it with somebody else here? I will get more out of that to share it.
Gretchen Smith is the director of the Edisto Island Historic Preservation Society. She's thrilled that her good friend Emily Meggitt is attracting so much attention with her cookbook.
It's just got so much more than recipes in the book. It's stories, it's anecdotes, it's the culture of the Gullah community. And it's not just a cookbook by any means. And I think that's what really has ignited the interest in it.
In the meantime, the gravy's ready.
All right, now you see what I put in there? I didn't put no celery, no bell pepper, no tomato, no other.
At nearly the last moment, she sautés the shrimp in a separate skillet. They're done in just a couple of minutes, and she quickly folds them into the sauce.
If you make the gravy and put the shrimp in there to cook, it makes it tough. Now you taste the gravy. Hot now.
Okay, I got it. Thank you.
You got to crunch of the shrimp.
She's absolutely right. The shrimp are firm and meaty, with almost a bit of a snap to them still. Finally, this tantalizing dish is ready, and you will never leave Miss Emily's house without getting fed.
The whole entire world. The whole entire world. It don't be a day pass by that somebody that'll stop by here that don't get something to eat.
As soon as the shrimp and grits are ready, we gather over the kitchen table for a moment of prayer, holding hands in communion. Ms. Emily says grace.
Thank you for family and friends. These and all other blessings I'm asking in your name.
And then we feast together. Anastasia Tsioulcas, NPR News.
Support for NPR and the following message comes from Eric and Wendy Schmidt through the Schmidt Family Foundation, working together to create a just world where
Well, thank you for sharing that time with me. I really wanted to share this because I think this piece, in a lot of ways, brings out a lot of different elements. One of the gifts I have as a radio reporter, as well as writing text, is that I can go into very small spaces, like a very small kitchen at Ms. Emily's house, and share that time with her and capture that sound and capture that immediacy of a thing we did together. You know, I know my brethren who do TV, it feels like a production. You know what I mean? Like, I stick microphones in people's faces for sure, which is intrusive. And I'm constantly apologizing for snuggling up to them with a big microphone. But there's such an intimacy to sound, I feel. And this is one of the reasons I really love doing this piece, and I hope you enjoyed it, because I felt like you got a sense of who Ms. Emily is. And obviously her priorities, especially with gravy. So thanks for letting me share.
That was wonderful. I love how you absent yourself for most of it, you know, and just let her voice, you know, you frame her voice, but there's not a lot of like back and forth as there sometimes in interviews. I really liked that just because it made her shine, kind of.
Thank you. And you know, I find that that's like a piece by piece thing. You know, when I'm doing a podcast episode, it's structured very differently. And I'm sure some of you are probably avid podcast listeners, and one of the things that I and my colleagues talk about a lot for those is starting with a question, a quest, a mission. And you sort of think of it as, I think of it as the top of a pyramid, and sort of everything cascades out from that. You know, if I'm doing a back and forth with someone, whether it's a host or an interviewee or whatever, like that's structured differently.
Yeah.
So this, I really wanted to have a sense that you were in the room with us.
Yeah.
And that she was absolutely the star, as she
Yes.
deserves to be.
Yeah, you
Yeah.
could definitely feel that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good. So how do you go about making a piece like this?
So, I mean, in this case, and I'll use this as an example, I was down in Charleston anyway for 3 other stories. And there's a big music and arts festival down there that I was doing some stories that are music stories. And I had heard about this cookbook through Ms. Emily's publisher, Abrams Books, and I thought, it's only an hour away. I can get a rental car, and you know, if she'll have me, and she did. So that was the genesis of this piece. You know, I'm really, really fortunate that a clear majority of the time, I'd say like 80–90% of the time, I can choose my own subjects, which is really something I treasure.
Yeah.
So you know, a piece like this, I knew I wanted Ms. Emily's voice at the center, because she is so lovely and her story is so integral to America. And she's a voice that, you know, one of my colleagues at work said, you know, that's a voice you don't hear very often and that we really should treasure, and I could not agree more. So I really wanted to make her voice the center. I knew I wanted to talk a little bit about the Gullah Geechee community. You know, even though this was a food piece, I wanted to get a little bit of the history. While I was standing in the kitchen, I learned this amazing history of her husband's childhood home. And I was like, well, that has to go in, you know? So I always think of these things as huge jigsaw puzzles, and I have a bazillion pieces on the table in front of me and trying to shoehorn them in. You know, if I were working at a newspaper, you know, yes, there'd be a word count. But sometimes, especially now in the digital age, that can be a little squidgy and you can run long. for radio, and the text version of this is much, much longer than the piece you heard. And there are actually several Miss Emily's recipes included on the page, which I highly recommend. But, you know, I'm chained to that clock. You know, everything we do, I have to, every little bit of music, every little bit of sound, every bit, you know, when she slows down to talk, we have to account for that. And I want to, you know, she's an elder, so, and her speech pattern happens to be a little stretched out. And I didn't want to, you know, close up all those silences, you know. I wanted her to sound like her. So every second that I do, I have to account for. So I'm sort of, they're jigsaw puzzle to mix metaphors, and also this clock hanging over my head. And one of the things I do is write and write and write, and read out loud and read out loud and read out loud, by myself, with my editor, through multiple drafts, so that we hit the time. And that was a skill that really I had to learn when I came to NPR. I'd done some radio work before for WNYC and elsewhere, but it really became kind of the overriding concern in my life was that clock.
Right, right.
So, yeah.
And was this one visit?
This was one visit. So I went there. You know, I wish I could have spent more time.
Yeah.
But I went there. I sat with her and cooked with her probably about 4 or 5 hours. Ms. Emily would not let me leave until not only had she fed me, but she had pressed a bunch of field peas and Carolina rice on me and Benny seeds to bring home. Because everywhere she goes on Edisto Island, by the by, people press produce and beans and grains on her, because she's very well known in her community. So like that, you know, that was a wonderful part of the time too. But you know, the job then for me is to come home and condense this experience down to however many minutes.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And do you turn it over to like a producer who?
No, I do most of
You
my
do
own
it
production.
yourself?
Yeah. So yeah, in the last. So I've been to NPR for going on 12 years now. I would say this definitely preceded me. There's more and more with technology and with budget pressures, and I know this is true for my for-profit media brethren as well. We are increasingly asked to do our own production work. My editor and I worked very closely with an engineer to sort of do the final mix and sort of, you know, the things that I did that sounded a little choppy. But that's all on me to do as well.
Wow,
Yeah.
okay. That's so interesting. I just assumed you would have like turned over this raw material.
Oh, I
and-
wish. I wish. So like, you know, so part of my challenge coming into this, when I was a freelancer and I didn't know these things, yes, I would sort of be like, here's this, and I'd like to use, you know, 30 seconds in, I think is where it started, but you be the judge. And now that's all on me.
Wow.
Yeah.
But it does give you some like artistic freedom, or you know, freedom to make it the way you,
Yes.
except for the clock.
Yes, freedom, and also sort of indulges all of my control freak.
Oh yeah, that's true. I know.
Because you know, and I value feedback from my editors. You know, I hope that's true for lots of folks. I'd like to say that I'm responsive to, you know, constructive criticism, because you got to kind of have a thick skin to do this kind of work.
Right.
You know, people say, this isn't working. You have to take that step back and you know, be willing to readdress. But yeah, I find that it gives me a lot of leeway to conceptualize something kind of in a totality.
Yeah.
And you know, hear things. I'm very lucky that I currently work with and have worked with some really sensitive editors who have a real ear as well as I.
Okay.
But yes, it sort of gives me that scope.
That's great.
Yeah.
So this is a very lovely, happy piece.
It is a lovely happy piece.
But I know a lot of the stories that you work on are not so lovely.
No, not so lovely in the at all.
So,
Yeah.
are those, what are the difficulties, I guess, of working on those more intense pieces, and you're trying to interview, I don't know, R. Kelly or someone.
Yeah, I mean, the last several years, it will not be a surprise to any of you to hear that I've done a lot of Me Too work, as lots of other folks have done. So like, for example, this time last year, I was just recuperating from spending the entire summer in court in the R. Kelly case. I am not mean to say that my job is akin to my friends and colleagues who are war correspondents or things like that. You know, that's not true. But when you do this work, that kind of work, it's obviously sensitive. Not the R. Kelly, but other stories I've done. I've talked to victims of sexual abuse and sexual misconduct, physical abuse, physical misconduct. So that's a very different experience than this. And it can be very difficult mentally, for sure, emotionally. And I'm very, very lucky to be at an organization that has a lot of supports for that. You know, for example, along with you know, having friends to sort of talk things out with. We have a really robust series of structures that put us in touch with therapists who are also journalists by training and worked as journalists, which is really wonderful. Yeah, because there are some things that are very specific to our, you know, to our profession. So yeah, it's hard, and I've really liked sort of leavening that kind of work with something that's pure delight. You know?
Right. That's great. Yeah. A nice balance.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And how did you go from, I know you were a musician, you still.
Once upon a time.
Yes. So how did you move from being a musician into writing about music and the music industry?
So while I was, you mentioned I went to Barnard.
Yeah.
So while I was there, I did major in comparative religion, that is true. What I really, really majored in was the Columbia University radio station.
Oh, nice.
Where I ran a couple of different departments there and then eventually became program director. And that was sort of my entry point into saying like, oh, I can do something that supports the creative community and sort of is part of the creative community in a different way, because I knew very early on that I didn't want to even try to become a professional musician. That wasn't the right path for me. And that offered me a way in. And as it happened, people literally started calling me at the station saying like, would you be interested in writing reviews of albums? You get to keep the CD. It's like, that is so glamorous. So that's how I started. So even when I was an undergraduate, I was starting to write for very, very small publications. And after I graduated, I went to work at a very large record company. And I did that for a while and wrote on the side.
Okay.
And it sort of snowballed from there.
Okay. Wow.
Yeah, so, you know, like by the time I was at Billboard, I was also, as a freelancer, working for various public radio programs. And I was like, oh, that's a nice side job, you know. Like, they'll never take me for real, but, you know. And eventually, NPR had an opportunity, and I was like, I really.
And you've been there for 12 years?
Just about, yeah,
Okay.
going on, yeah.
That's great.
Yeah.
And before that you were at in a different part of NPR, or is that
So that includes,
Okay.
so yeah, I
Okay.
came to be a producer for NPR Music, which is Tiny Desk Land. And I stayed there for about, I guess I was like there for 7-ish years, but like for most of that time, I was also doing stories for All Things Considered and Morning Edition. And then about 4 years ago, we also went, This Is Nuts, you know, you should be doing this full time or
Okay.
close to full time, so that's
Okay.
nice.
And do you miss at all doing the production side of things?
I do.
Yeah.
I mean, I do. You know, it's a funny thing. I miss the production. I miss putting great music literally in front of people that way, in a very immediate way. That's the thing. Again, going back to the control freak tendencies. I love curating things like that.
Yeah.
But at the same time, this has given me scope to do things that are outside of music. You know, I've been
Right.
covering, you know, this summer I've done everything from Jean-Michel Basquiat to working with Miss Emily to like, you know, it's given me
Many of the arts.
many of the arts, poetry, like all kinds of things that, and that's very fulfilling in a different way.
Right,
So,
right.
yeah.
And how were you drawn to the Me Too subject matter? Was it, I mean,
You know, this was around the time that Jodi Kantor and Megan Twohey's work and then Ronan Farah's work was really starting to bubble up. And things that were, people said they knew, or like were common knowledge, but had never been really investigated, or people tried, let me correct myself, people had tried to investigate. There's a long, long, long history for many of the names we hear about now, that people had tried to, journalists had tried to look into very seriously. And people wouldn't talk. You know, alleged victims wouldn't talk, witnesses wouldn't talk, friends wouldn't talk, family members wouldn't talk.
right,
And sort of as Me Too percolated into what I would say is a real movement,
Yeah.
a strong movement, people found the support to come forward because, you know, the fear of retribution was very, very real and continues to be.
right.
So it was just sort of that cultural moment that
Yeah.
more things became possible.
Yeah.
Having said that, I will say, and I know this is true for many of my colleagues I've talked to, at all kinds of media outlets, there are many stories we haven't been able to tell because we haven't, you know, the process of corroborating is very, very slow and very, very long. You know, last year I published a piece about the former head of the Tony Awards, who is a famous Broadway costume designer by the name of William Ivy Long. And that piece took me more than a year to put together because, you know, the layers, the process of corroborating
Yeah.
his accuser's stories and talking to people about things that happened 2 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, was very slow. You know, trying to get Mr. Long to talk to us,
Right.
talking to Mr. Long's lawyers many, many times. You know, like it's a very, very long process. So a lot of times those stories that we try to work on don't ever see the light of day.
Right,
And it's not for one of trying.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And was that a story that you were breaking?
There have been, the William Ivy Long.
Yeah.
One of the men had come forward a couple of years ago to another media outlet, and he made the accusations, and there wasn't much response beyond like a very insider Broadway community.
Oh, right.
And the other accuser who came forward called me, found me because of another Me Too piece I had done, and said, oh, you seem to know this community, you seem to know some of the people involved, you know, can I talk to you?
Yeah.
And that sort of kickstarted another thing. And one of the reasons that man came forward to me is he had seen the first accuser come forward, and there not been sort of the kind of support for the other accuser that he had hoped for. So that was sort of that was a strange situation because we had had one person who come forward publicly before, one person who came forward in public to me, and then like in corroborating the story, another person said, who was, you know, I had called to say, did you witness anything? Not only had he witnessed, he also was an alleged victim. So like, you know, these things kind of snowball and it takes a long time, and of course, I'm very dependent in those situations on the trust and goodwill of people.
Right.
And that's about building relationships.
Yeah. And how do you do that? Especially during the pandemic.
Yeah, it was
That was
incredibly hard during the
very
pandemic.
difficult.
I was meeting people in parks with masks.
Okay.
I was, you know, a lot of phone calls, a lot of, I'm only, I mean, and I found that one of the biggest things was just acknowledging to people, this is a weird situation that neither of us have ever found ourselves in before.
Yeah.
And, you know, and I'd walk through, and I always do this, always, sort of walk through a process like, you know, please tell me what you're willing to share. You know, this isn't going to go, initially, you know, this isn't going to go any further than me and possibly my editor, and I sort of walk them every step of the way. We talk about the implications, right? We talk about, I mean, coming forward, especially as an accuser, still has huge implications for that person's professional life, personal life, possibly finances, possibly legal situation, right? So we try to walk through all of that and say, like, you know, we want to make sure that you're doing this in the full knowledge of what the implications might be,
Right.
you know.
Right.
And the social media blowback and the blowback from the person you're accused, like,
Yep.
you know, there are all kinds of levels. So I try to take it extremely slowly
Yeah.
and thoughtfully.
Right.
And of course, you know, all of what we do, we corroborate, as I said, and also, you know, we have a, you know, we go through many layers of upper management and our legal team going through and so sort of examine the story and say, can you back up everything that you're saying in the article? Can you back this up? Can you back this up? Can you back this up? So nothing like that ever goes out without being really seriously considered. Wow. By a host of people.
Right. I just wanted to pause to say, if you have questions that come up, please just raise your hand. We don't have to wait till the end.
For sure.
But what are some other issues that you're passionate about reporting and that you spent time?
You know, one of the things I'm really passionate about is representation in the arts and diversity in the arts. It means a lot to me on both a personal level as well as a professional level. So I've spent a lot of my time trying to amplify underrepresented voices. That's extremely important to me. So that could be anything from, you know, people performing at Carnegie Hall to, you know, programs for kids, all kinds of things.
A recent story you did on Muslims in TV programs.
Yes.
Like how few
Yes, that's right.
Muslims appear
That's
in
right.
popular TV
That's right.
shows.
I've done, so that's a project of USC Annenberg Inclusion Initiative, which is doing all kinds of amazing work across representation of many underrepresented communities. So their most recent study was about the representation of Muslim characters in speaking roles. It's so, you know, because they're academics, it's so specific.
Very specific, right.
Yeah, exactly. So Muslim representation in speaking roles pre-pandemic. You know, they sort of boxed it to 200 series that aired in 2018 and 2019.
Okay.
And, you know, it was like they looked at, I think, nearly 8,600 characters. One character was an LGBTQ Muslim across that entire swath. You know,
Wow.
you know, the majority of those characters were, what a surprise, violent Middle Eastern men, you know, involved in terroristic acts.
Right.
You know, not, and so, and yes, so I
Yeah.
do that kind of work for sure. Yes. Yeah.
Okay. And do you tend to work on, I imagine you tend to work on multiple
Oh, yes.
pieces of, like
Yes.
how many are you
So,
juggling?
I can take right now as an example.
Yeah.
Right now, I'm actively working on 5 features of like this length. I'm also, I get pulled in, we have a rotating system for breaking news. So one day a week, I'm sort of, whatever happens in the universe that might be vaguely cultural related, I'm your girl. And so like, and then between those things popping up, I try to do like stupid administrative tasks.
Right.
But so it's a real balancing act. You know, yesterday I jumped in to write an obituary for a Greek actress because, you know, I sort of divided and conquered with a colleague of mine. She did the radio piece, I did the digital piece because we couldn't both do both at the same time, so. Yeah,
So
yeah.
you really have to be very organized and.
Yeah, I'm working on that. It's a perennial college. Yes, I mean, I think of it, I've gotten very, very good, for better or worse, at compartmentalizing over the years. You know, so yeah, it's juggling in sort of a million, both physical folders on my computer and mental folders of, you know, am I working today on, I don't know, what am I working on? I'm doing a piece on the history of San Juan Hill, which was the neighborhood that was mostly Black and Puerto Rican residents that was condemned by the city and was raised to make space for Lincoln Center, which is airing next month. And so that's like literally what I was working on today. So, and part of yesterday after I finished the obituary of Irene Pappas.
Right.
So yeah, it's a lot of jumping around.
Yeah. And are you working from home most of the time?
Yes, thank you, pandemic. Yes, I, along with many of our colleagues, have finally kitted out closets in our houses.
As little studios.
As little studios, exactly. But you know, I've done live reporting from literally like sitting at the closet at like a Holiday Inn, you know, with a hotel bedspread over my head. Because yeah, it's super glamorous, let me tell you. You know, you make do. You make do. If any of you are interested, like Google bedspreads, radio reporters, and you will see so many pictures of us with, yeah, because you have to dull the sound to make it sound a little bit like a studio and block out all the ambient noise. It's very hot under there.
And is this like your ideal form for telling stories, do you think? Are you ever interested in other, you know, ways?
I have done something, yes. I'm a huge believer in matching the platform to the kind of storytelling. So the example I fall back on is tiny desks are a certain kind of platform, right? Because you want to put the artist literally a few feet from the camera. And that creates an intimacy that people don't get on stages. I did last year, 2 years ago, it's a pandemic blur, I did a piece about a video documentary about this Church of St. John Coltrane in San Francisco that premiered at Sundance. We were very, and that I thought was a deeply visual story as well. And we really wanted to do something that gave people the sense of the people involved in this very singular church, and lots of opportunity for music. And Christian McBride, the great musician, did the voiceover for us. So that's a different kind of storytelling. Ms. Emily, as we talked about, like I wanted her to be front and center.
Right.
So I really wanted to have her as a radio feature and not just a text piece. So I'm a big believer in matching the kind of story to the platform.
Right.
Yeah.
And how did you, I think you may have said this already, but how do you hear about, how did you hear about Miss Emily? How do you hear about?
Well, Ms. Emily, I heard from her publisher, and and then Kim Severson, who's an amazing food writer at the Times, did a profile of her, and I was like, that doesn't. It's not about following the Times, it's just Kim's a wonderful writer, and I got such a sense of Ms. Emily that I was like, I really want to do this.
Yeah.
Oftentimes publicists pitch me, but my bigger job and my bigger responsibility, I believe, to the audience is to go out and find stories, rather than sort of be, you know, sometimes publicists do amazing work. There may be some here.
Careful what you say.
They also want to illuminate and amplify their clients' work and their lives. But I also believe that you find the great stories by looking for them, and once you it goes back also to trust. I feel like once you build trust within certain communities, people will start calling you, and that was certainly true for me.
Right. That's right. Does anyone have any questions? Yes, Boo?
One question. Hi. So big week for R. Kelly. I saw.
Yes.
So I have a question about like language and truth. Like, even when I see R. Kelly, when I see his picture, like there's still a part of me that doesn't want to believe it actually happened, and I think it comes from like the horror of it. So is there a way as a writer that you use language to kind of break through people's denial and shame around stuff like that?
That's a really interesting and deep question. I'll try to answer it on a couple of levels. First of all, and I'll use R. Kelly just since you mentioned him, and obviously he's in the news again this week. He obviously had an alleged history that went for decades, right? Like going on 30 years. There were a couple of very, very, very fine journalists whom I admire so very much, who did work, first Jim DeRogatis, first at the Sun Tribune, at the Sun-Times, and his colleague Ivan Palish, and then many years later, Dream Hampton, the wonderful journalist and filmmaker, picked things up from there. Having said that, at that point, legally speaking, those were all allegations, right? So we always had to use the word allegedly. In the reporting, in headlines, in describing the episodes, there's a protocol that you have to go through, both legally and ethically, right? That like these are unproven. In R. Kelly's specific case, after the New York conviction, which is the first of 2 federal trials in the past 2 years, we could start saying that these things had happened because it had been proven in a court of law in a criminal trial. Now the charges of which he was convicted in Chicago, we can now individually, collectively refer to as these things have happened because they were proven beyond reasonable doubt in a trial. That's the first thing. I would say, and I don't know how many of you saw Surviving R. Kelly, the docuseries that Dream Hampton put together. The fact that Dream got several of the accusers in front of the camera to recount their own stories clearly was very powerful for a lot of people. When you see people talking about their own lived experiences, that's a powerful thing. You know, Jim wrote an amazing, very, very hard book to read, but a really, really important book called Solace, The Case Against R. Kelly, in which he laid out the work he'd done on R. Kelly for over decades. And Jim, whom I would say I count as a friend and certainly someone I admire very much professionally, gave an interview a couple of days ago to one of the Chicago news stations. He, by the way, was the one who had received the tape, the infamous tape, back in 2000, 1999, 2000, I can't remember. And he said, you know what, we can stop using the word allegedly now. Like that was one of the biggest victories he saw in this, is that we could say, okay, it's been proven beyond a reasonable doubt. So it works on a couple of those, but I think, you know, it goes back to this corroboration thing we were talking about. You know, if you can show your readership, show your listenership, show your viewership that you have done your job as a journalist and that you have corroborated. You're not taking people's stories at face value, even if they're heart-wrenching. You're taking that distance and saying, okay, is this corroborated to satisfaction that this thing really happened or these things really happened?
And just to interrupt you, so corroboration means multiple
always
people saying the same
multiple
thing.
things, you know, for example, and I'm not talking about R. Kelly, I'm not talking about any specific work I've done, but I'm just saying in general, multiple people saying, yes, this accuser told me about the thing at the time, you know, or, you know, very close to the time. What do you remember about? Or I was there and I saw it. You know, I mean, obviously that's the best, right? Best. I used the wrong word, but like that's the closest confirmation you can get. Vetted and vetted and vetted and vetted and vetted. Gotcha.
Questions?
Yes.
That just made me think of it, but I was reflecting, I've been reflecting a lot recently when you see kind of like news outlets in quotes, because they're kind of just like people writing whatever. And then there's actual journalists who do things that involve corroboration, but a lot of people just see two pieces of writing
Yep.
and they're kind of like comparing them. Does that ever get frustrating, or do you ever find yourself trying to like more clearly differentiate yourself where it's opaque to a lot of people, how one is a process that's got a lot behind it and the other really isn't?
I mean, yes, and, you know, I think I can only speak for myself, but I get the sense that that's a widely shared frustration. I think one of the things that is really crucial in that context in particular is sort of, you know, how teachers always say, show your work, you know? We try to show the work. We try, you know, we try to yeah, exactly. I heard transparency, that's exactly it. You know, you try to be as you try to be transparent, you work through being transparent, you show your work. When I write a piece about allegations of sexual misconduct, I can't say, I talked to so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so, because there are privacy issues involved in that. But, you know, what we say is, you know, NPR corroborate, and I'll just use our network as an example, NPR corroborated this with multiple people, you know, who were there, who so-and-so spoke to, you know, 2 months later, you know, whatever the situation was. Is, for me, it comes down to trying to be transparent and showing my work. And it's an ongoing process, right? It's a process, you know, and that's, I try to show my process.
Okay, good to see you. But how do you find, like, how, I mean, to me, it's, as you're finding these stories, how do you ensure they're relevant and they're gonna hit the mark? Like, because it's not like you're doing market research or anything like
Oh,
that.
no,
Like,
no.
how do you?
Oh, well, you know, it's a funny thing, right? Because a couple of things, you know, one of the gifts and challenges of living in 2022 is that the feedback is immediate and obvious. You know, social media, even for NPR, social media in response, and Google SEO and Google search is huge, right?
So that's a
So it's a measure. There are certainly times that journalists, myself included for sure, pour themselves into a story that they are like, this is relevant, or this is going to happen, or this is going to hit people in the heart, or this is going to blah, 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 and it just misses the mark. And you know, it could be something got screwed up on, you know, there was a technical delay, like your website crashed or whatever, you know. And the piece that you thought, people are going to see this when they wake up and have their coffee, doesn't go out till 10:30 at night, and you're like, okay, you know, I did that. And you can try to salvage that kind of thing. Or there are things that, you know, one of the interesting things about radio, and I have never worked for television, but I would suspect would be true for my colleagues at TV channels, especially the news channels, is we have often a passive audience, right? Like, you know, people are listening while they're driving, or they're walking the dog, or they're, you know, commuting. It's a totally different setting than if someone is like, I'm clicking through, I'm spending X time on a page reading, you know. I've intentionally sought this piece of information out, or intentionally sought out this story. And when you're radio, it's a little bit of a potpourri, right? You get the, you know, you get the news from Ukraine, you get the news on the economy, you get the news on maybe there's going to be an Amtrak strike. You get, you know, you get a joy, like a little bit of joy and uplift. You know, there's an interview with a really interesting actor, and that becomes like, that's a very different experience. So, in my universe at NPR, I'm sort of thinking about those audiences simultaneously, which is always an interesting challenge. message. And like I always personally, and I for sure talk about this with my colleagues constantly, is you got to believe in the work you're doing. And like you do your work, try to amplify voices of the people you want to highlight, and hopefully it'll find its audience.
I know you've been working on the Plácido Domingo case too.
Yep, that's been that's been a long time. More
Not
time
an
of my career than I
uplifting
thought.
case, but yeah.
Yeah.
And there was a recent, something about a crime circle that he.
Yes, he, it turns out, was associated with an alleged ring of sex traffickers in Buenos Aires. And weirdly enough, several of the people who have been arrested as central to this ring are working classical musicians, which you don't really think about.
Oh.
So that was sort of the latest go round with Domingo and Domingo world that I've had. Yeah.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, it's just and he, just to give a little bit of context, was one of the biggest opera stars in the world, one of the most bankable names in opera in the world. 3 tenors, Carreras, Domingo. Well, I should put it the Seinfeld way, right? Which is Pavarotti, Domingo, and the other guy, who is Jose Carreras. But someone who had become a household name, and over the last few years, starting in 2019, a colleague of mine, a peer of mine, at the Associated Press, wound up eventually had more than 20 women coming forward with allegations of sexual misconduct against Domingo. And there was an enormous amount of fallout afterwards. He lost his positions running the Los Angeles Opera. He lost pretty much every engagement he had in the United States. The Metropolitan Opera kept ties with him until a number of Met employees came to me and said, we're outraged that we have to work with this guy. And what really set people off, and I published this so I can share it, is that they had a rehearsal, Domingo walked out, and then an HR rep came in after he'd left and put down pamphlets on what to do if you've experienced sexual misconduct at work. Yeah, that I think was really the thing that triggered people. So anyway, I published a couple of articles. He and the Met, after that, parted ways. There was a whole other, there's union involvement that they essentially, one of the singers' unions tried to create a deal with him that he would pay a penalty to the union, and the union would sort of close its, it wouldn't close the investigation, but he would pay a settlement, and the union would consider it square. And a whistleblower came to me about that, and that fell apart. So anyway, I've had many chapters in my Domingo reporting. But the most recent one was this crazy one, frankly crazy one in Buenos Aires.
Yeah, hi.
Hi.
I have a quick question.
Sure.
There's been so many of these Me Too cases that I may be wrong about this, but didn't NPR have this within its own ranks?
Yes, we did. Yes, we sure did.
And
We absolutely did. Yes.
Did you cover yourself?
Yes, absolutely.
You did?
Yes.
Okay, I'm
So
curious.
a friend and colleague of mine, who is our media reporter, David Folkenflick, took primary responsibility for that coverage. And Folkenflick's work was not at all vetted, and we published this, was not at all vetted by senior management. I mean, it was vetted still, but it was not reviewed by senior management who were involved in that. And the person who was accused left NPR, and yeah.
And
So yes, it meant a lot to us too. And
management was criticized
absolutely.
for letting this
Yes,
go on.
yes,
Yeah.
Sure was.
Who was it?
Mike, I
That's
promise you I'm not being
there's
coy,
so
I
many.
cannot.
Google it later.
Yeah, let's go, I don't remember. I will also point out that my colleague, I believe it's Mary Louise Kelly, who's one of the anchors of All Things Considered, brought the then president and CEO of NPR in for a very tough interview. Again, the questions not reviewed beforehand, to essentially ask him a lot of tough questions.
She's
about
tough.
that. Mary Louise, yeah, she's amazing. And I'm always honored to share time with her and share airspace with her.
We have time for, yeah,
Yeah.
2 more.
So, this is like a very interesting, but such a tough time to be a journalist too, right? And like, especially like the content you report on is, sensitive, and you hear so much about personal attacks on reporters and cancel culture, like, attacking journalists in that way. Like, how does that factor into kind of the decisions you make, and are there protections that like NPR offers, or I don't know, how do those considerations play out?
Yeah, so a couple of things. There are, similar to what I said about being everything from a war correspondent to covering Me Too, I'm very lucky that NPR recognizes the challenges of this and sort of gives us internal channels and support and structures. I do a lot of coaching and mentoring of younger aspiring journalists. I've been and will continue to be doing some guest lecturing at Stanford. And what I get, you phrase that so politely, unsurprisingly, a lot of young people say to me quite flatly, like, should I be going into this?
As someone whose daughter considers.
As I'm well aware. And I am happy to be a resource for her. And that is an invitation I extend outwards too. If you feel drawn to it, if you feel it's a calling, it's absolutely doable and possible. In some ways that can be in different media than it used to be. I was thinking about this last week, the week before, the journalist turned activist Barbara Ehrenreich died. And she wrote, among 20 plus books that she wrote, was one that was really important to me, even though I started out as an arts journalist and still do mostly arts journalism. Her book Nickel and Dimed, which was a first-hand account of taking minimum wage jobs for 6 months and trying to see if it was possible to get by. One of the things she did in the last decade plus of her life was set up fellowships for young people who came from impoverished communities to report on their own communities, their own life experiences, rather than some omnipotent outsider coming in and doing something patronizing and terrible. Probably terrible, except for Barbara, who's amazing. The opportunities, channels like that, avenues like that, we see things like, there's kind of a bubbling era of TikTok journalism, right? And we certainly, I can't help but think of George Floyd, and a young woman who became completely, inadvertently became the most important journalist, or arguably the most important journalist on the planet, thanks to a cell phone. There are different avenues. The traditional routes are different and frankly smaller than they were, in a lot of cases. Having said that, there are so many more avenues and platforms than ever before. But coming back to the whole question about showing your work, I think that the more that, whatever path these young journalists take, the more that they rely on showing work and being as ethical as possible, as transparent as possible, that is so key, and that will be the way to separate the noise from, something that really is trying to be representational and truthful.
Yeah, that's a a great place to end. Thank you so
Oh,
much.
it's such a pleasure.
Thank you so much. And we'll be back in about a month on October 13th. Marietta Zacher, who's also local, she's a literary agent, and she and maybe a couple of authors, we're not sure yet, will be talking about Latinx voices in 21st century publishing. So if you have any interest in that area, especially like children's and middle grade YA literature, please join us for that one. But thank you all for coming, and thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you so much.